and welcome back to What Now on the threshold of life, death, and grief. And I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
I'm Julie Brown. And we're here with another friend and colleague tonight, Dr. John Beamish. Welcome, John.
Nice to be here, guys.
So nice to have you back with us. So this is kind of a different kind of episode. We haven't done this kind of before with a guest. We're going to talk tonight about death anxiety and specifically about how the four of us in the work that we do, kind of traveling that journey with folks who are dying and grieving. Of course, that at times kind of can trigger our own death anxiety, and how do we cope in that kind of companioning work that we do. And so we thought we'd have a conversation with that. And when the three of us were talking about that, we thought that we should ask John to come back and do it with us as well. So thank you.
I think thank you.
We'll see where this goes. So probably all of you get that question or have had that question many times through your career. How do you do this work? How do you cope with not only some of the heaviness, but more specifically, what we're going to talk about this evening is what it brings up in you, or when that triggers something about somebody you may love, or it just kind of starts to hit close to home. So what comes to mind as we jump into this?
Well, I certainly have had many instances where that kind of is front and center. I remember that one time where it really struck me, and it wasn't so much about my death, but the death of one of my children, because I was dealing with a family and their son, one of their sons had died through an accident. But it turns out that both of their boys were exactly the same age as my boys. And in fact, one of their birthdays was the same. So when I got finished that session with them, it just like a wave, just wow, just hit me. So what I did was I picked up the phone and talked to both of the boys, and they probably thought that was kind of weird. Like, Dad, what are you doing calling, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? Oh, I just wanted to talk to you, see how you were, make sure everything's okay. But I realized that's what it was. It was that confronting of that experience of death of somebody that I certainly didn't want to die.
It's interesting you say that. As I was thinking about this topic, I realized I don't have so much death anxiety. I do have grief anxiety. So my own death, I have a sense of equanimity about it. I think you have to have that in order to do this work. You have to come to peace with the reality that death is universal and it's going to come in your time. So you do get to a certain level of comfort with that. Because you do spend a lot of time thinking about it, doing palliative work. So if you can't come to grips with it, you don't do well. And so I find I'm comfortable with the thoughts of my own death. The thoughts of the death of those who are close to me, that gives me anxiety. Yeah.
So have you had scenarios, situations like what David just described, John, where you've been working with a patient who you can feel that familiarity between that and somebody you love in your life?
The echoes.
Yeah.
Yes,
echoes.
Absolutely. Lots of patients will set off echoes, and you have to be aware, you have to say, okay. And sometimes you have to step back. My family has a long history of alcoholism, and I found I could not work well with a lot of alcoholics patients. So I would often have to pass off to a colleague because it just triggered me too much. So, and we all have those. We all have those folks who, through no fault of their own, set off echoes and anxiety within us and impair our ability to do our work.
I think I deny and cry. That's what I do.
Deny and
cry.
You better say a little more.
Live in denial and then cry every once in a while. Deny in that sense of I think I'm very aware of that sense of I don't know if you were alluding to that sense of distance, that sense of I can't take everybody's grief on. I can touch it, I can feel it, I can experience it, but I can't carry it myself. And so I think over the years I've gotten relatively good at that. Although I can remember one time a friend's father died, and he was a good friend, like you're friends with your father, with your friend's parents. And it was when I was working in palliative care, and there were a lot of really significant deaths. Now, I wasn't paying attention to that. And then my friend's father died, and I was sitting, watching television one night, and sort of an eye on the an ear on the TV and an eye reading the paper. And Mr. Dressup died. That's what was on the news, and he was my favorite as a kid. And so I'm sitting behind my paper, and all of a sudden I realize I'm just weeping. Mm-hmm. And I'm going, well, why would I be crying because Mr. Dressup died? And so I have to take my heart to my head. But why else? I wouldn't be crying if I had known this normally. What else is going on? And so I think what I like to do is do a lot of examining of what has gone past, to kind of go, where are those markers that I maybe didn't pay attention to, or I denied, or I just sort of, kept at an arm's length and didn't realize I was carrying with me. And so I'll often do that sort of just if I feel off, I'll go back and go, what's happened the last couple of weeks that I might be carrying that I wasn't aware. And so that sort of experience taught me, and this was like years ago, taught me to sort of take that inventory every once in a while just to see what I was carrying that I didn't know I was carrying. I also think it's one of the only jobs where I've had where crying is quite often something that you do. Yeah. You can't live and sit with that suffering and not feel it. And so I was like, if I feel overwhelmed, I let myself become overwhelmed. And it's not like overwhelmed like a mess, but I'll have a tear roll down. Yeah. And I think you can't stop that.
The sorrow can be heavy.
Yeah.
And you have to sometimes let it out, and that's fine. Yeah. And then you need a space for it too, which I think is what you're alluding to. You need a safe space you can go and do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's really important for people who start out into this work. If you don't do this work on yourself along the way, you're not going to survive, as you mentioned. And I think that's a good thing. And that's, I think, the misunderstanding that people have. So that idea of, how can you do that work if you're dealing with death all the time? But at some point, as you said, John, you have to come to that sense of, I'm going to die, and I'm at peace with my own death, as much as I can be at this point. But it's, and I love how you distinguish that as opposed to, the grief challenge of death, of caring. And that's what I have found too in talking to people who are close to their dying. If I were to say to them, are you afraid of dying? And they would often express that to me. No, I'm not afraid of my own dying. I'm afraid of what it's going to do to my family.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm afraid of leaving my family, that kind of approach. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was just what I was just about to say, having, had a fairly long period in my recent life around confronting my own death and mortality. That is something that I started to unpack, that my fear of my death was less about death and more about what that would mean, most specifically to my children. They were young. And of course, having been a therapist for 25 years, I've worked with so many people who lost parents when they were young, and it impacts them for the rest of their life. Like, it's a really, really significant event. And so for me, as I took time to unpack my huge anxiety through my cancer journey, it was so much about the idea of abandoning my children and the impact that would have on them, and less about my fear of dying.
Yeah. And I think in our current times, which in many sense are post-religion, and the fear of death, the fear of judgment, the fear of punishment isn't what it was for prior generations. So the act of being dead doesn't hold that same terror. But I think we're much more heightened to the impact on those that are left behind. And that's what, when you're dying, you worry about.
I think what I'm hearing us saying, it feels like it might be easier to leave than be left.
Well put, Red.
Yeah.
That's well said.
Because when you're left, that means you've got to live with it, right? When you die, you're not living with it. you're not
Your
dead with it
atoms
either.
rejoin the universe.
Exactly. You are wherever you go and whatever happens. But when you're left, you have that to carry then, that sorrow and that grief to carry.
So that means, and I'm just sitting here thinking, that means that, yes, even if we do our work with our own dying, I mean, that's never totally finished, but it seems to me that this is an ongoing piece that we do have to work on, is that how that impacts us from day to day. So when somebody dies, and it still goes on. I mean, I've just had a good friend whose spouse just died very suddenly, and it really did, impact me again. So I think that's the ongoing reality of the work that still has to happen, which is normal grief. Mm-hmm. So we're not immune from those feelings at all. And I think the whole idea of death still has a way of reaching into us, just because it's not me.
And when you stop being impacted is when you need to get out.
Yeah, that's a good point, John.
Because, that reaction, that's our humanity coming forward. And that's what we work with in this work, is our humanity.
Well, and I think that's every day. I was just thinking, you feel that sorrow, you feel that fear sometimes, but it's also reminding us about how to live, right?
Yeah.
That, when you're working, I would say there's one foot in death, yes, but the other foot's in life. And it's sort of, I always say, I hope I can have the same grace and dignity when it comes my time to face my end that I see in the people I work with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if there's a prayer, that's sort of it for me. It's like when you're surrounded by people who are showing you such dignity and such grace and such courage, even though they might be afraid, that's still courageous. I look at them and say, I hope I have a portion of that when my time comes.
It's what I say to myself about the grief anxiety too. Somebody just asked me yesterday, about all the grief work that I do and how heavy I must find that. And I said, I really don't, even though my heart is very touched by it. I have a lot of compassion for them, but I'm so touched by their courage. Mm-hmm. How resilient they can be, even though they feel completely broken. Mm-hmm. They'll say, I feel broken. I'm not myself. I don't think I'll ever be myself, and all of those things. And then I'm like, yeah, but you're sitting in the office with me and we're having this conversation, and you're going to keep coming here and you're doing other things. And so although see their feeling broken, despair, pain, hurt, I also see their resilience. And I also hold the hope of, I know this will change over time with the right support, with lots of love, with, making sure we kind of don't get stuck in things. And I don't mean that whole brighter days are ahead, but just, I know this will change for you. And so I see their resilience. And that is what I also, to your point, Red, tell myself too. Like when my time comes to be that griever, I hope I can find that resilience in me too.
Yep.
Well, doing this work, you learn what the tools are you need to go to in that situation. So we have a leg up that way. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same thing when you work with the dying and you see that they can be kept comfortable, that their families can have some healing as they die. And you realize, okay, when my time comes, I know the resources are out there. And that helps a little bit with the anxiety. Mm-hmm. The other thing in the work that I think is you focus on the journey, not the end point. So you're very involved in the day-to-day, the short-term, the long-term hopes. And that's what you're thinking about, not so much the end, not so much the death. And I think that's what allows a lot of folks who do this work to keep doing it.
Yeah, it's that point of saying, yes, I know it's coming. There's nothing I can do to stop that. So let's put that there. Now let's focus on this, right? That ability. And I think that's helpful for anybody to say, okay, let's talk about your death. Let's rehearse that. Let's talk about what you want, what's important. Okay, now we've done that. Let's not stay in that. Let's now talk about how we're going to live till we get to there. And that kind of ability to do that. I'm interested in, and I'm being very honest here about, my own sense of this as I age. So what role does aging play in both our perhaps being more, I don't want comfortable, I'm not sure the word, but it's certainly accepting or the reality of my own dying. I mean, there comes, I don't know how you know, I'll pick on John because
we
he's
are
not
at a
that far
certain
behind.
age.
All right, we're pretty close. But I think for me, and I'll talk for me, when I reached, I think 70 was the point for me where it really was this sense of, I probably only have, so many years left. Mm-hmm. And that sense of, okay, but that doesn't scare me, as you to your point. That doesn't really frighten me at all. It just allows me to ask, okay, so what do I want to do until I get there? Like, what's important? But if I was 30 or 35, I don't think about how much I have left, right? I'm thinking about, all the things I've got to do and everything else. So the fear of death at that point, or death means so much more loss, perhaps, than death at this point, where, I honestly, if death were to come quickly tomorrow, I could say, I've had a good life. Mm-hmm. I've done what I wanted to do. Life is good. Mm-hmm. I still have more, I hope, but it's not like I'm 25 or 30 and saying I'm getting robbed of what I want to do.
Yeah, David, I agree completely. And that's the way I look at it as I approach 70. That, okay, my years are limited. And it's back to something Red touched on. It teaches you to live more intensely in the moment. And that, I think, when I talk to my colleagues who do palliative work, they've learned that lesson that you treasure the moments as they come along because they are limited.
They are.
And that is one of the beautiful things about this work is like when you're sitting with a client who is dying, you feel that preciousness. You feel that honor of like, wow, you've just given me an hour of your time. And we know your hours are limited. And there is this it feels sacred.
Sacred is exactly the word on my mind. Mm-hmm. You're allowed to enter into a sacred space. Right. And I think in healthcare, there's two areas you can do that. Yeah. One is birth and one is death, where you break through the norms and can really be intimately with someone at a person-to-person level. Mm.
John, you mentioned at the very beginning that you can feel in a place of equanimity about your own death. Did you feel that way 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because you've been doing palliative care work for a long time?
I think it's been with me for a long time. I think you have to get to that in order to do the work. You have to, at some point, come to peace with that reality. Now, you don't welcome it, and you think, oh, well, it's going to be a long time off. But as David says, at this point in my life, it's not so far off. But yeah, you have to live with the reality of your own death in order to do the work.
Do you see that in your callings, in your physician callings, as they work their way through that in younger physicians? And
yes, you see the growth and the acceptance. Absolutely. Absolutely.
David, your words there reminded me of a gentleman you introduced me to maybe when I was first coming on.
I was thinking this too.
And you brought me with you to a visit. And what he said to you, he didn't have many words left at that point, but he said to you, it's no longer academic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think as we get older and as we know that there's less time ahead, it stops being one of those academic things, hey, we can talk about when we're 35, because it's not going to happen to me when I'm 35, right? It's somewhere down the road. But as you can start to see the end of the road, it stops being academic and it starts becoming very real.
And I appreciate it so much. I'm so glad you got to meet that gentleman. But he was one that taught me so much about life and dying. Yeah. And that's where I think people who are dying are the ones who are, if we're willing to listen and to be open, they have a lot to say to us. And that line, I actually had that inscribed in my desk at one point on that. So, yeah, it's not an academic exercise at this point.
Yeah.
So one of my go-tos for the last several years, post-cancer treatment, as I was working through some of the trauma around that and the death anxiety, was I turned to Buddhist psychology, Buddhist philosophy, which is not new to me. But Vinnie Ferraro talked about this in a previous episode, the 5 remembrances. And they are very dear to me. I have them taped up on the side of like my cabinet in my clinical office, so that if I have one of these moments where I feel the echoes, to use your word, John, I'll say to myself, if I feel that trigger, I'll say, but I am of the nature, right? So if I start to have the anxiety come up about illness, about death, about somebody I know dying that is dear to me, I'll just repeat to myself, like, but I am of the nature. We are all of the nature to grow old, to have illness, to die. And there's something about that for me that has been very powerful as a tool to work with. It's kind of like Peter Levine, who is a Buddhist teacher, talks about having just a soft belly to our life. And there's a softening, like a softness that just goes, oh, right. And rather than bracing always in this fear around, oh, that just echoed to my own story, is to say, right, but I am of the nature. You are of the nature. I am of the nature to grow old, to have illness, to die. And there's something around just inviting that in rather than bracing against it that allows me to work with it in the moment. Now, having said that, I think of that term, of that phrase you just used, it's not academic. And I always say, like, this is what helps me in this moment. I don't know if I'm going to be able to hold on to that when I'm in another moment where there's a diagnosis, there's an illness. But I know that this is what serves me as I do my work right now, is just remembering, coming back to the 5 remembrances.
I'm hearing a theme in all this, and I've written it down on a piece of paper here, circled it so I wouldn't forget it. The role of control in feeding our anxiety, whether it's death anxiety or bereavement anxiety. If we think we're in control, and I think that's one of the things I try to tell myself, and maybe it's the 5 remembrance as well, is that I can't control this all the time. And as a result, why should I get anxious over something I can't control? But it's really, really hard to sit down and think, wow, I'm really not in control of much or really anything. And I think that can create a lot of discomfort for people. And so we brace ourselves and we struggle and fight against those thoughts and that when they come, or those concepts of my own death. So I try to often wonder, what am I trying to control, and is it futile? Am I trying to hold back the river when I just can't?
That's the whole culture we live in, is fighting against it, right? Like, you're not aging, you're not getting older. Mm-hmm. We live in a world where that's our nature, and as I get older, that's what the body's telling me. This is where you're going. This is normal. But if I'm fighting that all the time and not denying, you talked about denying and crying, but denying this normal process of moving, of aging and everything else, that takes up so much of our energy to fight that.
And to do the work, you have to give up control. Mm-hmm. Because if you are focused on control, you're missing the journey. And I think when we do our best work, it's when we're walking with people and accompanying them. And to do that, you have to give up control, because you cannot control where this journey's going.
I think hopefully telling people the only control you have is the decision you make for the next step. Like, what is it? What decision are you make? That's your control. Yeah. Beyond that, you're really lost. So maybe the next control is, I'm going to go take this treatment. That's the control I have. I can't control the outcome of it, but this is the control I have, is to make the decision what I plan to do.
Yeah, there's a difference between choice and control. Mm-hmm. Choice is an option that you can follow. Control is the end result, and that's the piece you can't control. You can't control. Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting how often I hear with somebody who's had a diagnosis or their loved one has, and one of the first things they'll say is, but I thought he did everything right. Mm-hmm. I don't understand. So that idea that they've been, and I had this, living under the illusion that we have more control around illness than we actually do. Like how often, and you see it. I mean, it's just all over social media these days. It's like, do this, drink this green juice, work out in this way, do, whatever. And now we have these like longevity coaches that are out there, and this idea that here's the magic elixir, live life in this way, and bad things won't happen to you. That's all about giving people the illusion of control. And then when a diagnosis comes, then they feel like they're this failure that in some way, because we've been fed the conditioning, the message that you can control this.
Yeah. And that there are guarantees.
And that there are guarantees.
And there are no guarantees.
No.
There are no guarantees.
I've got this cartoon, and it's this guy at the pearly gates with St. Peter and a clipboard, right? St. Peter saying, non-smoker, check. Oh, healthy diet, check. Oh, regular exercise, check. You gave it a really good shot, didn't you? Like the guy did everything right, and yet here he stands. I think those are the things I use to ground me.
Yes.
There's another one. I don't know who did that cartoon, but Calvin and Hobbes one that I love, and it's a dark sky. Calvin's standing outside looking up at the stars, and he screams up into the sky. He says, "I am significant," and the next two squares are just him looking back out at you in the night. And then the fourth square is him standing there kind of going, "Scream the dust speck," And for me, that grounds me in my own insignificance. Because to the world and to the universe and to the whole matter of time, my life is not all that significant. I might feel it very significant living it in the present. But when it comes to the history of...
But that awareness of insignificance helps keep us grounded in the present.
Yeah.
And I think helps us live more fully in the present.
Right.
I think it can be very helpful. A little frightening at times, but the truth is frightening. But it keeps us in the present where we can do our work.
Mm-hmm.
John, did you resonate with what that comment about, people thinking they have these guarantees if they live a certain way? Like you must have been asked or told that all the time. Like, how did this happen to me? Yeah.
You see that. I mean, and I think it is a byproduct of our culture. Mm-hmm. Those are the times we live in. If we lived in the Middle Ages, we'd be thinking, I'm dying tomorrow.
I made 30.
That's great. The plague is coming through. But that's very much a product of our current culture. And when we talk about death-denying culture, it's not that we don't talk about it. It's that we create these illusions that we can control what's going to happen in life. Mm. But absolutely, that resonated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you can always ask that question, how many times have you heard this? Here's somebody who's living an absolutely unhealthy lifestyle, bad diet, smoker, drinker, and they're living to 89. And then someone young ends up with a life-threatening illness. And how do we make sense of that? There's an injustice there. Allows us then to be angry. Right?
We are,
and then death becomes something that's a cheat. We've been cheated.
I'm so interested. What would you say to people who would say that to you, John? Like an actual patient who was young in a scenario like that, who was diagnosed, and they're trying to make sense out of that, and they're saying to you, why me? I'm young. I've lived this healthy lifestyle. And, I got my grandfather over here who's done this, this, and this.
I think you listen, mm-hmm. you empathize, because, we all kind of get that. We've mm-hmm. grown up in this culture.
Absolutely.
But then gently over time, you help them realize that there are no exceptions. Mm-hmm. We don't have control. Mm-hmm. And as they journey through, particularly if it's cancer, their cancer journey, they realize how little control we have mm-hmm. and how little control the system has. Again, the system presents itself as being able to control, but it can't. Yeah. But it can't. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the moments you really can walk with people and help them. You don't have to change them. They'll get there on their own.
It is so true. And eventually I find that people will get to the place, most people will say, some version of it happened because it can.
Yeah, I think they do.
Rabbi Kushner, right? Bad things happen to good people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But when you think about it, when you think of the folks you've worked with, how often do you get someone to the end of their life and they're in denial? Very rare.
I have one. I can only have one.
Yeah, I've had one, and I'm sad to say this, but it has religious connotations.
Yes.
It's something
else.
false
It was an
hope
impediment.
that's going to rescue them at the last moment.
Yeah.
And I've watched somebody right up to the end, and they just.
But it's rare.
It's rare. It's very
rare.
Yeah, mine was too, where people were telling this person they were going to be healed, and it was all of this and that, and yes.
And I find that's more prevalent in family members or survivors, where that sense of they didn't see it coming, even though it was right in front of them, right? That sense of being in denial, that sense of not seeing what was happening in front of them, more so than with the person who's dying.
Yeah, I think the people who are dying, they get it.
Well, they feel the weight of that. I always get the weight of their own existence, like the weight of their body and the tiredness that comes with the process.
And those folks that you speak of, I feel their loneliness because they're getting a strong message from their family. You can't say you're dying, and they're alone with this. And it's, I really see their suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because then you really are dying alone. If you can't say that out loud because those around you can't hear it,
then you are
and
dying
don't accept
alone.
it, then you are really dying alone. Wow.
Anyone who has been to other cultures, and I really resonate with what you said about the cultural impact on our whole understanding and view of death. But for much of the world, death is part of living in a way that it's not pushed away. It's a reality. It's there.
It's a daily reality.
It's a daily reality. I remember one time I was doing a humanitarian project in building in a third world country, and this young, probably 8 years old girl came over and was standing there, and I was trying to figure out what she was wanting. And in the end, what she wanted was to borrow the tape measure because her dad had just died and they were trying to make a box for him. And she wanted to borrow a tape measure so she could measure. And I'm thinking, what 8-year-old in our culture would be part of a process? But for her, it was just part of the normal, not normal, but it was tough. But I mean, here she was. But that really shook me into, our cultures lives away from death as much as possible. And we even put people away up. We're doing better with that. But in my growing up years and middle years, it was, we put them in the hospital. And then when I first worked in the hospital, John, if somebody was dying, the door was closed. Mm-hmm. So it was really putting death out of sight. Mm-hmm. Whereas in much of the world, death is totally in sight every day. And you can't just run from it.
This is reminding me of things that are going to be coming in the future and future conversations that we're going to be having in the new year. And we're going to be speaking with Sheldon Solomon, who's going to talk to us about terror management theory, a part of which says it's the creation of culture that allows us that death-denying buffer. So if I can subscribe to the tenets of my culture, then I'll feel safer inside that, and I will have that buffer against the understanding that I'm going to die someday. And I think it's in this work, it's understanding that you are going to die someday, and thinking about that on a daily basis. And you were talking about somewhere we were talking about humanity, and I'm reminded of our conversation yesterday that we had with Harvey Chochinov. And he said the people who work in this world who are able to lead with their humanity and connect with another's humanity don't burn out the same way as people who try to buffer themselves and use their energy to resist the suffering of others. And so I think there's something there, too, that says if you can connect with the suffering of others in a way that's really human, in a way that sees them as a person, that then I think helps us keep doing the work.
I agree. You don't burn out. And to Julie's point, hand in hand with that is that you realize this is a privilege.
Yeah.
You're being allowed into a very privileged space.
And I would add to both of those, it's a privilege. You don't burn out as long as you don't try to fix.
Yeah.
Right.
Earlier in my career is where I got caught, and I did have a period of burnout. I actually have more energy for this work than I have ever had in my career. And that is because I've truly learned just, that kind of companioning, presence, be with. And I don't feel I'm not moved around to fix people's suffering. I nudge things when I feel like there's something I can help with. We can jump that hurdle, but I don't carry this big responsibility to fix anything. And that has totally changed the way I sit with people.
See, I hear you being comfortable in your lack of control. Like you're comfortable with not being able to control every aspect of the situation.
Isn't it a drag? I had to get cancer to learn that.
Wow.
And you're guiding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're not leading.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real difference there. You're letting them find their path.
In fact, a very common quote I hold in my head, it's like my mantra, was it's a Jon Kabat-Zinn saying, it's just, this will unfold in its own time.
Yeah.
Right? He says, patience is a form of wisdom. It teaches us that things will unfold in their own time. And whether that's, people grappling with guilt or anger and their grief or the palliative journey or whatever, I just can often say when I feel that pull from the client to like, come on, like, let's gallop here, or I feel a greater sense of responsibility to them, I can just kind of rest back into this will unfold. I don't need to push this so hard. I can just be the guide. I don't have to lead this.
One of the things that, I still do a few funerals, not many, but I still officiate as a celebrant some funerals. And what I'm conscious of, a couple of things. One, that often a funeral is the only time people really confront death. And they don't know what to do with that either. I mean, here they are, and all of a sudden they're there. So for me, I find that this is an opportunity to engage people in death, not just, in all the eulogies and everything. Those are important. But I think it's also a point where we can engage people in death and dying, in just that fact that, we are all going to end up here. So how do we choose to live until that time, right? But I think there are some things in our culture, not many. Funeral is one of them, where people are run face into death. But then we're doing everything not to do that. So we're calling it celebrations of life in a way that we don't even want to talk about the person's dying. And those are the pieces that we can't afford to lose, in my opinion, that we need. You don't have to call it a funeral, but we need to acknowledge death. And then as we gather, it's part of our grieving, obviously, but it's also a very teaching moment for all of us, a sobering moment to really reflect on that. So that's another value that I think is there that we sometimes let go of and don't take advantage of.
Yeah, and our humanity is shaped by the reality we die.
Absolutely.
And if you
John.
deny that reality, you're denying your humanity, and you are being less fully human.
Yeah.
So your point is well taken. I always chuckle. It's now we no longer die, we pass.
Oh yeah.
And you listen to the CBC or you listen. I mean, no one says the word death, dying.
So I don't know if I went through a period when I was working at hospice where I decided to, when anybody said, oh, he passed, I would say, oh, you mean he died?
Yeah.
And I remember doing that, and I did it to a doctor once. I'll never forget a physician who said, oh, somebody passed. And I said, oh, you mean they died? And they stopped. And yes, they died. But it's true. We just can't get that word in there.
No.
I think we like to forget that when we're born, death is born with us. We're born into life and we're born into death, and we celebrate the coming of a new child into the world, and we prepare for 9 months, and we create a room, and we paint it, and we buy gifts, and we have this big celebration. And we don't understand that what we're doing is we're inviting that new life into death. but we just focus on the life part, right? Because of course you're going to, but the reality is, the other side of that is that if this little person that was just born is now alive, it does mean inevitably that they are going to die, and we don't put a whole lot of time and effort into that process until we have to, and then we're shocked, then we're surprised, and I think that's part of that fault in our culture. What we don't do well is entertain and invite that other half of life into living, if that makes any sense.
So as we begin to close this conversation,
bring it to an end. We'll pass it along. What haven't we been able to speak to, or what feels still outstanding?
Well, I think I've discovered that it's a topic that I'm very comfortable talking about that isn't necessarily comfortable with others talking about. And I think the reality, as we have all acknowledged, is that it's part of our living. But how do we do that in a way that doesn't take over living, and yet it finds its place in helping us to live better? So it's an ongoing challenge. I'm not saying that, that when death comes that it'll be super easy to die. I have no idea. At this point, as John had mentioned, I think I've come to terms with my dying. I've thought about in terms of what that might look like, my hopes, but I don't have control of that either. So I also have that reality. But how do I engage that? And even as I get older, how do I engage this in helping prepare that in my family, in my kids and others, and without it appearing, in a morbid way, or that somehow I'm planning to die real soon. But how do I engage death as being part of living? I think that's a reality. We need to think about that and find ways to engage in that in a helpful way.
I don't know how to come off of that, but I think I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about the term giving over. You hear a lot about giving up or giving in, and I've been entertaining the idea of giving over seems more attractive to me. So no matter what's coming in life, whether it's death or something else, I'm not giving in to death. I'm not giving up on life, but I hope some way I can find a way to give over to reality, right? And then hopefully in my mind, I'm thinking pray that keeps me open to whatever possibilities exist in that reality. So if I give over to reality, I feel like it's okay if I can't control everything, that I am part of this larger system that's moving through, and my part is having this journey. And if I just give over to that journey, if I'm in the water in the current, if I just lift my feet and let myself flow with it, I might find the journey easier, and I might find that I get to where I need to go. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about that in terms of, and I think that helps with that whole concept of confronting our own deaths. If I give over to the fact that I am of the nature, then I stop railing against death and go, it's coming, it's going to be there. I don't want it today. I don't want it tomorrow. Hopefully it's somewhere down the road. But I see this as time to prepare for it. And if I can give over to that, for me, that's a little bit more of an appealing concept or idea than giving in and giving up sounds negative and hopeless. But giving over gives me a sense of optimism.
I think the acceptance allows us to live more fully. It frees us to be able to live. We're not pushing.
Right. We're not using
away.
that energy to push.
We're not using our energy to push. We can use that energy to live.
Yeah. And invite life in. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking, if it's okay, I would end with just reciting the 5 remembrances, because I feel they're all about acceptance. So the first one is, I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground on which I stand. Thank you, everyone.
The end.
The end. Thank you, John.
That was a great way to,
Thank
and
you.
because I think it touched on all that we,
Yeah.
we ended up arcing back.
It happens.
It happens.
These
yeah,
conversations happen like
Full circle. Thank you for listening to What Now? On the threshold of life, death, and grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is provided by Sean Heichert and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following the show, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing it with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.